It's surreal, really. He left me behind when I was 9 years old, traded me for a vacation with his new wife and her daughter, that Betty. And now, years later, they're back, hats in hand, begging for my help. But I have a move planned that they would never suspect. My father abandoned me to spend time with them, but now expects me to support Betty. Let me tell you the story of how everything fell apart after my mother died. I was just a little girl, only 9, and it felt like the world as I knew it simply ceased to exist. Mom was my anchor, my safe harbor. With her gone, that sense of security vanished, and everything was altered, irrevocably. Initially, I held on to the hope that my dad, Mike, he's 47 now, but back then, he was in his mid-30s, would somehow keep us afloat. I naively assumed that his role as my father would compel him to rise to the occasion. Spoiler alert, he didn't. For a brief period, things were almost okay. It was just the two of us, navigating a new routine in Mom's absence. He'd drive me to school, we'd share dinner, and while it wasn't perfect, it wasn't unbearable. Then, about a year later, he started seeing Jane. Initially, I didn't know much about her, only that she was significantly younger than my dad, maybe 12 years younger, which would have made her about 35. I remember the first dinner she had with us. She seemed pleasant enough on the surface, but looking back, the red flags were waving from the start. Jane wasted no time inserting herself into our lives. It wasn't long before she and Betty moved in, and let me tell you, Betty was the epitome of a spoiled brat. From the moment they crossed the threshold, they acted like they owned the place. Jane made no attempt to include me, she simply took over, as if she had been running the household all along. And my dad, for reasons I still struggle to understand, simply went along with it. I was just a child, a grieving 9-year-old, completely ill-equipped to navigate this situation. But I quickly noticed a change in my father. He wasn't really my dad anymore. It was as if Jane had become his sole priority, and I can't quite articulate it. Like I was physically present, but emotionally invisible. The situation grew worse when it became clear that I was no longer treated like a child in my own home. You'd think after losing Mom, both Dad and Jane would have offered some comfort, some kind of understanding, right? Wrong. Instead, I felt like I'd been demoted from family member to the hired help. Jane doted on Betty constantly, showering her with attention, while I was the one saddled with all the chores. I wasn't even allowed to voice my feelings, as if this new arrangement was simply the natural order of things. I was constantly cleaning up after Betty. She was 17, for heaven's sake, but she acted like a child, leaving her messes everywhere, and of course, it was my job to deal with it. While Betty was out with her friends or lounging in front of the TV, I was stuck washing dishes, vacuuming, or tackling whatever task Jane assigned me. Dad? He didn't lift a finger. He seemed perfectly content with his 9-year-old daughter being treated like a housekeeper. I couldn't grasp how he could be okay with it, yet I felt powerless to speak up. But what really broke me was the Christmas trip. Even thinking about it now makes me angry. That Christmas, Dad, Jane, and Betty, decided to go on vacation together. They were going somewhere nice, a cabin in the mountains, I think. Initially, I was excited because I assumed I was going too. It was Christmas, after all. Family time and all that. But no. I was told I had to stay home and look after Betty's dog, Max. They actually left me behind for a dog while they went off on this fancy vacation. Don't get me wrong, I love dogs. And Max was a sweet dog. But he wasn't my dog, he was Betty's. I suggested we board Max or hire a pet sitter, but Jane immediately shot down the idea. She said it was a waste of money and that I was perfectly capable of staying home alone for 3 days to look after him. I was 9 years old, and they left me alone to care for the house and the dog while they went off and had a great time. I remember sitting in the living room that first night, feeling utterly and completely abandoned. Christmas that year, it was a tangle of emotions, a knot of fear, sadness, and anger pulling tight in my chest. Christmas, of all days. Instead of carols and laughter with my family, I was stuck within the four walls of my house, babysitting a hyperactive dog that wasn't even mine. It felt like my dad had somehow erased me from his life, like I was a ghost in his new family portrait. The hardest part was the silent acceptance I saw in my dad's eyes. He didn't fight for me, didn't extend a hand to draw me into their world. He just seemed to acquiesce to Jane's desires, and her desire was clear: keep me at arm's length. That Christmas wasn't just a day, it became a stark dividing line in my life. After that, I felt a growing distance between us, a chasm widening with each passing day. He wasn't the hero I used to admire. He was someone who yielded to Jane's every whim, and I was always the one left wanting. Every holiday, every family gathering, revolved around Jane and Betty. I became a background character, expected to fall into line with their plans, their preferences. Honestly, looking back, I wish I had found my voice, stood up for myself. But at 9 years old, what could I have done? I lacked the vocabulary, the confidence, to confront my dad or Jane. I simply absorbed it all, and perhaps that's why things only worsened with time. But here's the saving grace: I wasn't utterly alone after that disastrous Christmas. My Aunt Sarah, my mom's sister, appeared like a beacon of light, accompanied by my cousin Danny. They had caught wind of what transpired and made it their personal mission to lift my spirits. They arrived bearing Christmas gifts, prepared a magnificent feast, and conjured the essence of a genuine holiday, even if it was a little late. Danny even stayed overnight to help me with Max, even though he had no obligation to do so. That's when it dawned on me: family isn't necessarily defined by shared blood or the roof you live under. It's about those who genuinely care, who show up when you need them most. Aunt Sarah and Danny became my anchors during that tumultuous period. They didn't have to step in, but they did, and that act of selfless love is etched in my memory. Without them, I'm not sure how I would have navigated those years of feeling insignificant. That Christmas unveiled the truth about who my true family was, and it certainly wasn't my dad and Jane. So, let me recount what unfolded in the aftermath of that Christmas catastrophe. As I mentioned, I began to drift away from my dad. After all, how could I not? It was as if he'd chosen sides, and I wasn't on his team. But there was more to the story, and in retrospect, everything that followed only cemented the feeling that I would never truly belong. The dynamic with Jane definitely didn't improve. In fact, it spiraled downwards. She seemed to relish her role as the lady of the house, which translated into a never-ending stream of chores dumped on my shoulders. By the time I was 12 years old, I was practically running the household: laundry, dishes, vacuuming, cleaning, you name it, I did it. And every time I dared to ask for a little help, Jane would just smile sweetly and say, "It's good practice for when you have your own home someday." Seriously? I was a child. I barely knew how to make toast, yet she expected me to maintain a spotless house. Meanwhile, Betty remained the untouchable golden child. She was 17 when Jane and my father married, and she had Jane completely wrapped around her finger. Whenever Jane even looked like she was about to ask Betty to do something, anything, around the house, Betty would suddenly have some elaborate excuse: homework, a crucial meeting with friends, some incredibly important event that demanded her immediate attention. And every single time, Jane let her off the hook without a second thought. I, on the other hand, would be on my hands and knees scrubbing the kitchen floor or cleaning up after their cozy family dinners. It felt like they wanted me to fade into the background, a silent, unpaid servant. But what truly infuriated me was my father's complete inaction. He would sit in his armchair, glued to the TV, while Jane barked orders at me as if I were some kind of hired help. He never said a word. Not once did he intervene and suggest that Betty, or even Jane herself, pitch in. I don't know if he was too intimidated to challenge her, or if he simply didn't care enough to notice. Either way, it cut deep. I remember once, when I was around 14, I finally gathered the courage to talk to him about it. I told him it felt unfair that I was burdened with all the housework while Betty got to relax and do whatever she pleased. And his response? Life isn't always fair. You just have to deal with it. That was it. No empathy, no understanding. Just a dismissive deal with it. After that conversation, I resigned myself to the fact that nothing would ever change. Hope evaporated. Now, this is where Aunt Sarah and Danny re-enter the picture. They didn't just vanish from my life after that one Christmas, you see. They stayed. Aunt Sarah became a constant fixture, appearing not just for birthdays and holidays, but on random weekends too, always checking up on me. And Danny, she was always there. Despite being a few years my senior, we formed this incredibly close bond, the kind I always imagined having with a big sister. Whenever Jane's constant nagging or Betty's chaotic messes became too much, I'd escape to Aunt Sarah's. Danny would treat me to ice cream, we'd go window shopping, or sometimes we'd just collapse on the couch and marathon TV shows. She became the first person I felt genuinely safe confiding in about everything happening at home. She understood how awful things were for me, and she never dismissed my feelings as being overly dramatic or anything like that. I remember one weekend, I must have been around 16, and I was staying over at Aunt Sarah's. Danny and I were talking, really just venting, about the situation at home. I remember telling her how Jane had chewed me out that week for not folding the laundry fast enough. It seemed like such a trivial thing, but it had really upset me. Danny just looked at me, her expression so serious, and said, "You know this isn't normal, right? You're not supposed to be treated this way." That simple sentence hit me harder than I anticipated. I had spent so many years just accepting this as how life was supposed to be that I hadn't even recognized how truly messed up everything was. Danny and Aunt Sarah were always so kind and supportive, but it wasn't until that moment that the possibility of a different life, a life outside that house with Jane and my dad, truly solidified in my mind. It felt like something fundamentally shifted within me after that conversation. From that point on, I slowly began to detach myself emotionally. I stopped focusing so intensely on trying to please Jane or even attempting to gain my dad's approval. I started prioritizing school, spending more time with Danny, and generally doing things that made me happy. I still did the chores, of course, because I had to, but I refused to let it consume me the way it had before. I kept my head down, reminding myself constantly that one day I would escape. And I was right. The day I turned 18, I received an acceptance letter to college, complete with a full scholarship. That was my golden ticket, and I had absolutely no intention of squandering it. On the day I left for school, Jane barely acknowledged my departure. She offered a perfunctory good luck before turning back to whatever she was doing. Betty didn't seem to care one way or another. But my dad, he actually seemed sad. He hugged me, the first real hug I could remember receiving from him in years, and told me he was proud of me. It was strange hearing those words after everything, but by then, they held little weight. College. It was my escape, a world entirely separate from that house I'd yearned to leave. A fresh start. I could be someone new, build friendships, and finally live without that constant feeling of being a burden, a live-in servant. Sarah and Danny remained my anchors, my unwavering supporters. Their care packages were little bursts of love in sterile dorm life, and their visits were a lifeline. Honestly, they were all the family I wanted at that point. But even miles away, Jane and Betty still managed to cast their shadows. About halfway through my first semester, my dad called. He presented it as this grand gesture, an invitation to come home for the holidays, orchestrated, he said, by Jane and Betty. Like suddenly, they were ready to welcome me with open arms. I wasn't fooled for a second. I could practically hear Jane coaching him in the background, dictating the script. It wasn't about me. She just needed an extra pair of hands to slave over the holiday preparations. I refused to fall into that old routine. I told him I'd be spending the holidays with Sarah and Danny. Period. He didn't argue, just sighed that weary, "Okay, maybe next time." Yeah, right. there wouldn't be a next time. I was finished trying to force a connection with my dad and Jane. They'd had their chance, and they'd squandered it. I had my real family now, Sarah, Danny, and the life I was building independently. So, looking back, I realized this. Blood doesn't necessarily define family. Family is about those who step forward, who offer support and love when you need it most. That's precisely what Sarah and Danny did for me. Now that you have the full story of my escape and how I handled Jane and my dad, you would think that things would quiet down, right? That the distance would create some peace? Not exactly. In fact, it felt like escaping was just the beginning, the spark that ignited a whole new level of drama. And unsurprisingly, it all revolved around Betty. I was a couple of years into college, finally hitting my stride. I had amazing friends, my classes were engaging, and for the first time, I truly felt in control of my destiny. Sarah and Danny were still my rocks, and I made every effort to visit them whenever possible. But the family dynamics with my dad and Jane, they remained a persistent undercurrent. I'd been diligently keeping to myself, a deliberate strategy for maintaining some semblance of peace. My logic was simple: focus on my studies, steer clear of trouble, and hopefully, things would remain calm. But Betty, it seemed, had other ideas entirely. Out of the blue, a message popped up on my phone from her. Now, let's be clear, Betty and I weren't exactly close. She existed in her own orbit, and as far as she was concerned, I was practically invisible, only useful around the house. So, seeing her name light up my screen, my immediate thought was, what does she want now? The message started off saccharine sweet, like we were lifelong confidants. Questions about college, my major, the usual superficial chit-chat. I was instantly suspicious. What was she really after? Because let's face it, Betty wasn't suddenly concerned with my well-being. There was an ulterior motive. I just knew it. Sure enough, she eventually got to the point. It turned out she was floundering in her own college courses. Floundering apparently meant failing multiple classes and teetering on the brink of academic dismissal. Predictably, Betty wasn't taking any responsibility for her predicament. It was always someone else's fault. The professors were unfair. The assignments were too difficult. Anything and everything was to blame, except for her own lack of effort. Then came the real reason for her unexpected communication. Hey, would you mind helping me out with my classes? Maybe write a couple of essays for me? I know you're really smart, and it would mean a lot. Yes, you read that correctly. Betty wanted me to do her work for her. After years of dismissive behavior, of acting like I was a servant, of treating me with indifference, suddenly she needed my academic prowess. The sheer audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless. I sat there for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, contemplating how to respond. A wave of resentment washed over me. Part of me yearned to unleash all those pent-up frustrations, to finally give her a piece of my mind. But I quickly realized that it wasn't worth it. Betty simply wasn't worth the emotional expenditure. Instead, I chose a simpler, more direct approach. I typed out a brief message: "Sorry, Betty. I'm swamped with my own coursework. Good luck with your classes." That was all she was getting. I owed her no explanation, and I certainly wasn't going to be drawn into her mess. Unsurprisingly, my response wasn't well received. She immediately resorted to guilt-tripping, spewing platitudes like, "I thought we were family, and family helps each other out when they're struggling." Family? That was rich. Since when did I become her sister in her eyes? The messages she sent felt manipulative, and I simply ignored the rest. But then, things took a predictable turn. Soon after I refused Betty, Jane called. I could hear the anger radiating from her voice. She launched into a tirade about how selfish I was being for not helping Betty, about how I was supposedly squandering a chance to bond with my stepsister. I was stunned. After everything, they still expected me to jump through hoops for them. I told Jane plainly that I wasn't going to do Betty's work for her, and maybe if Betty was struggling, she needed to take some responsibility for her own actions. Jane did not appreciate that response. She began to lecture me, saying I owed it to the family to lend a hand and that I should be thankful for all they'd done. Thankful for what, exactly? For years of feeling more like hired help than family? For being excluded from every family vacation? I refused to engage. I ended the conversation abruptly, telling Jane that my mind was made up. Hanging up on her felt surprisingly good. For the first time, I was setting a boundary, and I wouldn't budge. But of course, it wasn't over. A few days later, my dad called. I hadn't heard from him much since I moved out, so his call was unexpected. He started with polite inquiries about school and my general well-being, but I knew where this was going. Inevitably, he brought up the Betty situation. He tried to mediate, saying Jane was very upset and perhaps I should reconsider helping Betty. He even trotted out the tired family sticks together cliché, as if that would suddenly change my perspective. I almost laughed. Where was this family rhetoric when I felt so alone? Where was this sense of togetherness when I was the one constantly cleaning up after everyone else? I calmly explained that I wouldn't be pressured into doing something that wasn't my responsibility. I wouldn't allow guilt to sway me. It wasn't my responsibility if Betty couldn't keep up with her coursework. That was her problem, not mine. Dad didn't really argue after I said that. He just let out this long sigh, heavy with disappointment, and said, "I'm disappointed, but I understand." And that was that. The end of the conversation. I hung up the phone feeling the strange, tangled mess of emotions. There was definitely pride, a satisfaction in standing my ground for once, but underneath it all, a real sadness lingered. Sadness that this was what my relationship with my dad had become. Deep down, I still craved a genuine connection with him, the kind we used to have, but every conversation felt like navigating around this huge, invisible wall that had sprung up between us. Anyway, after that phone call, I didn't hear a peep from Betty or Jane for what felt like an eternity, and honestly, it was a relief. I just buried myself in my classes, spent time with my friends, and consciously tried to keep moving forward. I refused to let their drama pull me under. Then, a few weeks later, I got a call from Aunt Sarah. Apparently, the family grapevine had been working overtime, and she'd heard about the whole Betty and Jane situation. She just wanted to check on me, see how I was doing. We ended up talking for hours, and she reminded me, so gently, that I didn't owe anyone anything. "You've got your own life to live," she'd said, her voice full of warmth. "Don't let them make you feel guilty for doing what's best for you." She was right, of course, and hearing it from her, from someone who genuinely cared, made me feel even more solid in my decision. I wasn't going to let my dad, Jane, or Betty manipulate me into feeling bad for finally putting myself first. I had spent far too many years being pushed around, overlooked, and now that I was finally starting to build something real, something that was mine, I wasn't about to sacrifice it for their mess. So yeah, that's pretty much the story of how Betty tried to pull me back into the chaos, and how, for the first time, I said no. And honestly, it felt pretty damn empowering. Okay, so here's where the real shift happened. I was doing my thing, finally feeling some semblance of peace, completely focused on school, and deliberately staying far, far away from all the drama back home with Jane and Betty. And for a little while, it actually seemed like they had finally gotten the message. Like they had finally decided to leave me alone. But, of course, that peace didn't last. As it never does. One day, completely out of the blue, I get this email from my dad. It wasn't anything lengthy or overtly dramatic, just a short, to-the-point note saying that he and Jane wanted to talk. Immediately, a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard from them in months, so this sudden desire for a conversation, it couldn't be good. Still, despite everything, a tiny, stubborn part of me, the part that desperately wanted a functional family, still clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd finally changed. Spoiler alert, they hadn't. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. We settled on that little coffee shop in my hometown, the one on Main Street, a supposedly neutral place where I could make a quick escape if things started to go south. I walked in, feeling that familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach, and there they were, sitting at a table, acting like nothing had ever happened. Dad looked so worn, more aged than I recalled. And Jane, she was, as always, Jane. Distant, almost icy, like my presence was keeping her from something far more important. After the strained pleasantries, the air thick with unspoken tension, they finally got down to business. Jane, naturally, took the lead. She always had to orchestrate everything. "We've been discussing future plans," she announced, her voice adopting that saccharine tone she reserved for when she wanted to appear reasonable, "and we believe you should begin considering your obligations." I frowned, confused. Obligations? What could she possibly mean? That's when the bomb dropped. "Your father and I are getting on, and Betty, well, Betty needs assistance establishing herself." My mind stalled. They weren't concerned about my future. This was about Betty's. And somehow, inexplicably, they envisioned me as playing a key role in securing Betty's well-being. Betty, who never offered a hand, who treated me with disdain, who only contacted me when she needed something, and whom I hadn't spoken to in months. "Hold on, you want me to support Betty?" I managed to ask, struggling to maintain composure as anger began to simmer within me. Dad finally spoke, his voice heavy with weariness and resignation. "She's struggling, and we just thought, as her sister, you might want to lend a hand. You're doing well, and we thought perhaps you could, give her a little leg up." A leg up? Was this some kind of cruel joke? They were suggesting I financially prop up Betty? The very same Betty who couldn't even send a simple message unless she needed homework assistance? I felt like I'd stumbled into a bizarre alternate reality where everyone had lost their minds. I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the sheer audacity of their request. "So, let me clarify," I said, fixing my gaze on Jane, knowing she was the architect of this whole charade. "You're suggesting I take the money I earn, the money that sustains the life I've built, and simply give it to Betty? Because she can't seem to manage her own affairs." Jane didn't even flinch. "It's what family does. We support each other. And since you're in a fortunate position, we thought it would be appropriate for you to help your sister." In that instant, something inside me shattered. Years of feeling insignificant, of being treated as if I existed solely to serve their needs, came crashing down upon me. I was floored by the sheer nerve of what they were asking. "I'm not doing it," I stated, my voice ringing with a resolve I hadn't realized I possessed. "I'm not responsible for Betty's life choices. She's a grown woman, and frankly, if she can't navigate her own existence, that's on her, not me." My father started to interject, a familiar plea already forming on his lips, but I cut him off. "Are you even listening to yourselves? After everything, after all these years, you still expect me to drop everything, disrupt my life, and magically fix Betty's problems? When have either of you ever lifted a finger for me when I was the one struggling? You conveniently ignored me while I cleaned up after her messes, happily allowed me to be the forgotten one, always left behind as you all jetted off on family vacations. And now you expect me to play savior? Absolutely not." My Aunt Jane's face tightened, the familiar mask of righteous indignation settling into place. I knew the predictable accusation was coming next. She always had this uncanny ability to twist every situation, turning it around to make me feel overwhelmingly guilty. "You're being incredibly selfish," she accused, her voice icy and dripping with disapproval. "We've sacrificed so much for you over the years, and this is how you repay us? By turning your back on your own family when they need you the most." I couldn't help the bitter, sarcastic laugh that escaped my lips. "You honestly believe you've done so much for me? Leaving me to fend for myself during school holidays, piling all the household chores on my shoulders while Betty got a free pass to do whatever she pleased, never once treating me like my feelings, my needs, my life even mattered? Is that what you consider helping me?" My father, always the peacemaker, always avoiding conflict, looked down at his hands, carefully avoiding eye contact, not uttering a single word in my defense. Jane, however, was not about to back down. She was locked and loaded. We provided you with a home, we raised you, gave you opportunities, and this is the thanks we get? You're going to deeply regret this one day, young lady, when you finally realize the immense sacrifices we made for you. That was the final straw. I had reached my breaking point. I stood up abruptly, gathered my belongings, and looked them both directly in the eye, determined to finally make myself heard. I don't owe you anything, I stated, my voice surprisingly steady, considering the turmoil raging inside me. I've built my entire life from the ground up, completely on my own, without a shred of your help or support. If Betty truly needs support, then maybe, just maybe, it's time you step up and actually help her yourselves. But I'm no longer willing to be a part of this dysfunctional cycle. I turned and walked out the door before either of them could utter another word, my heart pounding like a drum solo in my chest. I felt a potent mix of anger, frustration, and, surprisingly, relief. I had finally voiced all the pent-up resentment and hurt I had been harboring for years, and it felt liberating. I wasn't going to allow them to drag me back into their toxic, manipulative cycle of drama and guilt. I was completely done being the perpetually selfless one, the one who was always expected to sacrifice my own happiness and well-being for everyone else's. After that confrontation, I didn't hear from them for quite a while, and honestly, I didn't miss it. The silence felt peaceful, a welcome respite from the constant pressure and expectations. The silence was absolute. No calls, no messages. And honestly, a part of me relished it. My focus narrowed, school, my friends, crafting the life I wanted. Through everything, I knew I had Sarah and Danny. They were my anchors, the family I chose, who showed up not when it was convenient, but when it truly mattered. I learned a harsh but valuable lesson. Family isn't always blood. It's about loyalty, support, and respect. Jane and my father? They consistently failed on all counts. Walking away from them was a choice I stand by. After the debacle with Jane and my father, you'd think I'd earned a reprieve, a chance to breathe. I'd effectively dismantled their scheme to get me to bankroll Betty, and I walked out of that coffee shop convinced I was finally free of them. But life, as usual, had other plans. A few months later, I was in the final stretch of my last year of college. A promising job awaited me after graduation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of optimism. Sarah and Danny continued to be my unwavering support system, and I felt like I was finally building something solid, something worthwhile. I maintained a strict no-contact policy with Jane and Betty, and the sheer distance from all the drama was incredibly liberating. But predictably, just as I started to feel settled, just as I dared to think I was safe, my father reappeared. I was deep in study mode, prepping for finals, when a text from him appeared on my screen. I hadn't heard from him since that excruciating coffee shop meeting. Seeing his name ignite a familiar mix of dread and resentment. What now was the first thought that flashed through my mind. The message was short, curt, a simple request to talk. No explanation, no context, just, hey, we need to talk. I debated ignoring it completely. I should have. But a tiny, foolish sliver of hope remained, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, he wanted to apologize. So, against my better judgment, like a complete idiot, I replied and agreed to meet. We ended up back at that same dreaded coffee shop. As I walked in, I braced myself, half expecting Jane to be there, but thankfully, she wasn't. He was alone, sitting hunched over a table, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him. The weight in his posture, the weariness in his eyes, warned me whatever he was about to say would be far from good news. We stumbled through the usual awkward small talk, a strained dance of forced politeness, but I could sense his anxiety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he blurted it out. "Betty's in trouble," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I don't know what to do." My stomach plummeted. Here we go again. What kind of trouble? I asked, already feeling a knot of apprehension tighten in my stomach. I just knew whatever was coming wouldn't be good. She dropped out of school, he finally admitted, his gaze fixed on the lukewarm coffee in his cup. He wouldn't meet my eyes. She was failing her classes, and, well, she hasn't been making the best decisions lately. And that's where I had to stop him at that vague phrase, bad decisions. I knew what that meant. It meant Betty was, yet again, acting irresponsibly, racking up consequences she fully expected someone else to deal with. And the sinking feeling in my gut told me who someone was supposed to be. She's staying with you guys now? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Yes, he confirmed, but Jane and we can't keep enabling her, not anymore. She's accumulated a lot of debt, and frankly, we're reaching our limit on how much more we can realistically support her. I stared at him, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I already knew where this was going, I just wasn't going to make it easy for him to get there. Okay, I said slowly, drawing out the word, and what exactly does any of this have to do with me? He finally looked up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw genuine desperation etched on his face. We were hoping you might be able to help her, he said, his voice carefully measured. With your new job lined up, you're in a far better position to offer her some assistance. There it was. The request, the expectation, the burden I'd been dreading ever since I'd seen his name flashing on my phone screen. They wanted me to bail Betty out. Again. I took a deep breath, trying to tamp down the simmering anger threatening to boil over. Dad, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, how many times do I have to say this? I'm not responsible for Betty. She's made her choices, and if those choices have landed her in a difficult situation, that's on her. I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am, and I am absolutely not going to jeopardize my future to clean up another one of her messes. He didn't respond immediately. He just stared down into his coffee cup, like he was searching for the right words amongst the grounds. Finally, he sighed, a weary, defeated sound. I understand, he said. I really do. But she's your sister. That was it. That was the breaking point. The dam holding back all the years of resentment finally burst. She's not my sister. I snapped, my voice louder than I intended, attracting a few curious glances from other patrons. She's never been my sister. From the moment Jane walked into our lives, you and she made it abundantly clear that Betty was the priority. I was never really part of that family. I was the one always left behind, the one cleaning up after Betty, the one watching from the sidelines while you all went on vacations, creating memories I wasn't invited to share. And now what? You actually expect me to be the one to rescue her? Absolutely not. The words hung in the air, sharper than I intended, but entirely true. His surprised expression, that almost wounded look, didn't sway me. He probably thought he could just ask. That I'd just fall in line. But I was through playing that role. You and Jane made your own decisions. You prioritized Betty, made her the center of your world. I accepted that. Resigned myself to it years ago. But you have to live with that now. I'm not some safety net you can pull out when it suits you. If you want to help her, by all means, go ahead. But don't come crawling to me expecting me to fix it. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I saw the pain flicker in his eyes, but I didn't regret my words. Not even a little. Maybe I should, but the truth was, standing up for myself, for once, felt incredibly liberating. He eventually nodded, a slow, reluctant gesture that suggested a grudging understanding. I'm sorry, he mumbled, the apology barely audible. I didn't realize how much we hurt you. What could I say? An apology couldn't erase years of feeling second best. It wouldn't rewrite our history. And, honestly, I was done trying to mend something that was fundamentally broken. All I wanted was to move on, to build a life that was truly mine. We finished our coffees in silence, the clinking of ceramic against saucers the only sound in the small space. When we left the coffee shop, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it was likely the last real conversation we would ever have. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive ending, more like a slow, quiet drifting apart. But it was a break, a severance of ties. The anger had faded, replaced by a weary sense of finality. I was done with the guilt trips, the subtle manipulations, the unspoken expectation that I was responsible for smoothing over every family crisis. After that, I focused on my own path. I graduated, landed my new job, and consciously moved forward. I have Aunt Sarah and Danny, and they are all the family that I need. Betty? I truly don't know what became of her, and to be brutally honest, I don't care to find out. She made her choices, charted her own course. Now she has to navigate the consequences. As for my father, I haven't heard from him since that day in that little coffee shop. And maybe that's for the best. Okay, here's the perhaps he's finally come to terms with the fact that I won't be the ever-reliable fallback option they always imagined. Or maybe the thought of facing me now, admitting whatever it is he's dealing with, feels too humiliating. Honestly, a part of me suspects it's a combination of both. But whatever his reasons might be, whatever internal struggle he's navigating, I find myself remarkably calm. I've spent so much time anticipating this kind of silence, bracing myself for the inevitable disappointment, that now it's actually here, it's almost a relief. I'm not saying it doesn't sting, because it does, but I'm no longer caught in that anxious loop of hoping and fearing. I think, more than anything, I'm accepting it. Accepting that this is how things are, and that maybe, just maybe, it's for the best.